sister changed her gender. I can't believe it. What do you do when someone you've known your whole life decides to completely change? I heard it on April 7th, on our mom's birthday. Everyone gathered at our parents' house in a small town near Boston. It was the usual annual celebration where nothing ever changed. Mom's traditional dishes, Dad laughing loudly at his own jokes, and Olivia always bringing a pie. But this time was different. I don't know if it was just me or if something was truly off, but Olivia seemed tense. After we sat down at the table, she suddenly stood up, and I sensed that something was wrong. She never started conversations, but here she was. "I have something to say," she said calmly, but I saw her hands trembling. What followed was something I could never have imagined. "I've decided to change my gender. My name is now Oliver." The room went silent, so thick it felt as if time had stopped. Dad quickly got up and left the room, slamming the door behind him. Mom began to cry, and me, I just sat there, unable to move. My mind was in chaos. Olivia, my sister, how is this possible? She was my best friend, the one who always listened and understood me better than anyone else. My mind refused to process it. I felt as if cold water had been poured over me. I was trapped between my love for her and my anger over her decision. I didn't know how to react. On one hand, I saw her eyes, full of both determination and fear, and on the other hand, there was my own fear and confusion. I never thought I'd face such a situation. Life had already been knocking me down for the past few years. First, the divorce, then losing my job, and now this. My younger sister, who had always been a symbol of stability for me, decided to take this step. I was in total despair. Why was everything falling apart? Why was everything I held dear turning into chaos? I just left the room after my father. I didn't know what I was feeling at that moment, except for emptiness. Olivia's words kept echoing in my head. I paced back and forth outside the house, unable to find peace. I couldn't even look her in the eye. Was it fear, anger, pain? I couldn't find the answer. Reddit users' comments. Emotional wave. 77. I get you, man. When my brother came out with something similar, I didn't know how to react either. It's hard to accept right away. I hope you find the strength to support your sister. She's probably feeling lost too. Transalia 23. This is definitely a tough moment for everyone. But remember, she's still the same person you've known. She might need more support than you can imagine. Boston Dad. 5. As a father, I don't think I could immediately accept it either. But you have the chance to be someone who helps your sister, not someone who turns away from her. Skeptical 1. I know it's tough, but sometimes people change, and as cliché as it sounds, it's important to give them the chance to be happy. I had a similar situation with my cousin, and a year later, we found common ground. After that day, I came home, completely shattered. It was April 8th, 2024. Around 10 p.m. when I stepped into my small apartment in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I still couldn't recover from the shock. Everything that happened during the dinner replayed in my mind like a looped movie. Olivia, Oliver. I couldn't get used to this new reality. How did this happen? What led her to such a decision? I sat on the couch in complete darkness. Only the ticking of the clock on the wall marked the passing seconds, emphasizing my plunge into emptiness. Olivia wasn't just a sister to me. We grew up together in a small house on Willow Street on the outskirts of Boston. I'm 2 years older, but we've always been very close. Since childhood, we shared everything from secrets to childhood fantasies about the future. We always played together on that old playground around the corner from our neighborhood. When I look at old photos, I see how Olivia was always beside me, smiling, with her long dark hair almost always in a ponytail. She never seemed unhappy, so why didn't I notice that she was suffering? Today, after her confession, everything changed. I tried to organize my thoughts. Do I really know my sister? I thought about her words. I've always felt out of place, but how could that be if she always seemed so happy? I kept asking myself the same question while sitting in the apartment, which suddenly felt too small. And this was even before the pressure from my father began. Dad made it clear from the beginning that he didn't accept this. He had always been strict and traditional. He was 56 years old, and for most of his life, he worked as a mechanic. He taught us that there's a masculine and a feminine, and that everything has its place. What Olivia is doing isn't normal, were his words as we drove home after that evening. He wasn't shouting, but his words were chilling. Dad had always been an authority figure to me. I always tried to live up to his expectations, but now I didn't know how to react. On the other hand, there was Mom. She had always been more gentle, but even she didn't know what to do with this. She's 54 and works as a nurse at a local hospital. I could see her trying to hold herself together, but her eyes were red from crying. She was confused. Mom had always supported us, but this time she was scared. She only said one thing: "I just want everything to be like it used to be." Her words echoed in my head. That night, I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw Olivia, how she sat at the table, looking at us, waiting for our reaction. I saw both her fear and determination at the same time. This wasn't the girl I used to know, but at the same time, it was still her, my sister. I couldn't understand if I would ever be able to accept her as she wanted to be now. The next morning, on April 9th, I decided to talk to Olivia. We agreed to meet at a cafe on Charles Street. It was our favorite place where we used to spend hours, drinking coffee and discussing everything under the sun. But this time, I felt that I wouldn't be able to calmly look her in the eyes. I was nervous. When I arrived, Olivia was already sitting at a table by the windows. I noticed that her appearance had changed slightly. Her hair was shorter, and she wore a loose sweater that hid the contours of her body. This wasn't the Olivia I knew, but at the same time, it was still her. She greeted me a little nervously and we sat down. At first, we talked about ordinary things, but I knew the main topic of this meeting hung in the air. Finally, I gathered my thoughts and asked, "Why are you doing this?" I didn't know how else to phrase the question, but that's all I wanted to know. Olivia looked at me and smiled slightly. "Mark, this isn't something I decided yesterday or even last year. I've always known something was wrong. I tried to hide it, to be the person everyone wanted me to be, but it's no longer possible." Her words hit me hard. It turns out she had felt this way her whole life, and I never suspected it. We talked for over an hour. Olivia explained how hard it had been for her to live in her body, how she started noticing it as a teenager. "Do you remember when I was 16 and I started wearing baggier clothes? I already knew then, but I was afraid to say anything. I recalled that period. Back then, I thought it was just a phase, teenage rebellion, but it was much deeper than that. To be honest, it was hard for me to accept all of this. Every word she said shattered my previous understanding of our family, of Olivia, but at the same time, I felt I needed to understand her. She spoke so sincerely about her struggle, about how long she had hidden her true feelings, that I began to question my own judgments. Maybe I just hadn't understood her before. However, the pressure from my father continued to weigh on me. He called me several times that day, after my meeting with Olivia, and each time he repeated the same thing: "You shouldn't support her in this. It's not normal." His words felt like a heavy burden I couldn't shake off. How could I split myself between my father, who had always been an example to me, and my sister, who had suddenly become a completely different person? That night, I couldn't sleep for a long time. My mind was filled with thoughts of our childhood. I remembered how Olivia and I used to play in the backyard of our old home, how she always wanted to play roles where she was the hero or a soldier. Back then, I didn't think much of it. Now I realize that it might have been the first sign that she didn't feel free in a female body. Memories of our childhood kept surfacing. When Olivia was little, she always asked me to teach her how to ride a bike, and I remember how proud I felt that I could help her. But now, I didn't know if I could help her with this. She stood before me as a completely different person, and I didn't know how to accept it. On the morning of April 10th, I woke up with a heavy heart. I knew I had to make a decision, but I couldn't find an answer. Should I support my sister, turn away from her for the sake of the family, Life seemed to force me to choose between what I had known all my life and something completely new and incomprehensible. Reddit users' comments. Open mind, 88. It was hard for me to accept changes in my brother when he made a similar confession. But in the end, I realized that it's his life and he has the right to be whoever he wants to be. Lost in thoughts, 25. Your doubts are understandable. This is really difficult, especially when you're being pressured from all sides. But ultimately, you have to listen to your heart and what it tells you about your sister. Family first, 54. I think family is important, but supporting loved ones in moments like this is the most important thing. Your sister hasn't changed her essence. She's just revealing her true self. Heavy burden, 99. I had a similar experience with my brother. It took me a few years to understand his choice, but now we're closer than ever. After several weeks of doubt and reflection, I finally decided that I needed to talk to Oliver in person. It had been almost 3 weeks since that day when he announced his decision at our mom's birthday celebration. It had been a tough time. I felt like I was losing my footing, constantly caught between my father's expectations and my own doubts. On April 25th, I texted Oliver, saying I wanted to meet just to talk. I couldn't continue living in this conflict between reality and my preconceived notions of how things should be. We met at a small cafe on Bridge Road, which was almost empty that day, with just a few people sitting by the windows. I had specifically chosen this place because it was always quiet, and I knew we could calmly discuss important matters. I arrived early, nervously scrolling through the news on my phone, trying to ease my anxiety. Oliver was 10 minutes late, but when he walked in, I immediately recognized him. Though the changes were obvious, he no longer wore the dresses that had always emphasized her femininity. Now, he was a man. Short hair, a sporty jacket, jeans, a simple look, yet I still felt the familiar energy. We sat at the table, and the first minute was filled with silence. I didn't know where to start, and it seemed Oliver felt awkward too. Finally, I said, I just want to understand. Can you explain to me why you did this? This question had been tormenting me for weeks, and I needed to hear the answers firsthand. Oliver exhaled, seeming to prepare himself for a serious conversation. Mark, I know this is strange for you. It was strange for me too for a long time. I can't even imagine how hard it must be for you to process right now. But I've been living this way my whole life. The feeling of being out of place started in childhood. Remember when I was 12, and I always asked you to teach me to do what boys usually do? Bike races, hiking with Dad? But I wasn't doing it just because I wanted to be with you. I wanted to be you. His words hit me straight in the heart. I started recalling our entire childhood. How often Olivia had asked me to teach her what I was doing. How she always wanted to play the role of a boy, even when we were kids playing in the backyard. Back then, I never paid attention. It was just child's play, but now I saw that for her, it was more than just a game. It was hard for me to accept, even to admit it to myself. Oliver continued. Every day when I looked in the mirror, I saw someone I wasn't. You can't imagine how hard it is to live in a body that doesn't fit you. I tried to hide it for a long time, but I couldn't anymore. It was hard for me to hear these words. Oliver explained that he had thought about transitioning for a long time, but the fear of our family's reaction held him back. He was afraid of Dad, afraid of losing us, but at some point, that fear became less important than the desire to be himself. I listened without interrupting. His story was painful, yet it opened my eyes. I began to realize how important it was for him to find his own happiness. He had been living his whole life hiding his true feelings, and it was unbearable. At that moment, I understood that my doubts about his decision weren't as important. What mattered was that he finally felt free. With that conversation, I slowly started to understand that his decision wasn't about us, wasn't about Dad, wasn't about society. It was about his own life. Oliver told me he had started the process of changing his legal documents and would officially become a man, which gave him a sense of control over his life. I saw him light up as he spoke about it. It was a happiness I hadn't seen in him for a long time. When we finished our conversation, I didn't feel the same heaviness in my heart as I had before. Of course, it was new to me, and I couldn't say I fully understood everything, but I felt relieved that Oliver had been honest with me. We agreed that we would stay in touch and wouldn't let this decision ruin our bond. Later that day, April 25th, I met up with Jake, my best friend. We went to our favorite bar in Harvard Square, where we'd often hung out since our university days. I told him everything that had happened in recent weeks about Oliver's coming out and how it had impacted my life. Jake listened attentively without interrupting, and then unexpectedly said, "You know, I've met a few people who have gone through something similar. It's not as rare as you think." His words surprised me. I'd always thought it was a rare occurrence, something unusual that only happened in the news or movies. But Jake explained that at our university, Harvard, he knew several people who had also transitioned, and it helped them find themselves. He told me the story of one of his acquaintances who had struggled at first but became much happier after transitioning. "Mark, you can't live for someone else. Your brother is doing what he needs, and you can either support him or push him away. It's your choice, but I'd advise you to give him a chance." Jake's words resonated with me. He was right. I couldn't impose my idea of who Oliver should be. I had to let him decide how to live his life. That conversation with Jake was crucial for me. It helped ease the tension I was feeling and gave me a new perspective on the situation. Jake had always been the rational one, and his support gave me the confidence that I could support Oliver too. After that evening, I decided I would stand by my brother, no matter what Dad or anyone else said. I didn't want to lose Oliver because of my prejudices or fear of others' reactions. I understood that it was his life, and I needed to support him on this journey. It wasn't easy, but I knew it was the right thing to do. When I arrived at the family gathering on May 15th, the feeling was strange. It was my father's birthday, and we had gathered in the same house on Willow Street where we grew up. However, this time, there was tension in the air. It was the first family event since Oliver had announced his transition. It became clear to me that my father hadn't invited him. That made me furious. I knew the moment would come when I'd have to choose between my father and my brother, and that day had arrived. Reddit user comments, Supportive Sis 90. "It's so important that you took the time to listen to him. I remember when my sister made a similar decision. It was tough at first, but now I can't imagine her any other way. Open eyes for all. Glad you didn't give up in the beginning and gave your brother a chance to explain. So many people just turn away, and it hurts both sides. Your story is a great example for others." Harvard Life 13. I also went to Harvard, and it's true. Many went through a similar process. For many, transitioning was the only way to true happiness. Skeptical minds. I can't imagine how hard this was for you, but supporting your brother is the best decision. They need their closest family, not judgment. There was a strange atmosphere in the room. My father, as usual, sat at the head of the table, joking with friends and relatives, but his gaze kept drifting toward me. I could feel that he expected me to stay silent. My mom was quiet and nervous, as if afraid a conflict was about to erupt. She was trying to maintain an air of normalcy, but I could see that it was hard for her. It was unbearable to sit there, knowing that Oliver, my brother, couldn't be present because he was being ignored. My father avoided any conversation about Oliver and clearly didn't want anyone to mention his name. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up and addressed my father directly. "Why isn't Oliver here?" The room fell silent. It was like an electric shock passed through everyone. My father slowly turned to me and said, "Because he's no longer part of this family." His words hit me like a punch. "What do you mean, not part of the family?" I replied. "He's as much a part of us as anyone here. If you can't accept him, then I see no reason to stay." I felt like I was speaking on behalf of everyone who has ever suffered from prejudice and cruelty. Because of their identity, my father looked at me with shock and anger in his eyes. "Are you willing to tear this family apart because of his strange behavior?" he asked sharply. This was the moment of truth. I had always seen him as an authority figure, but this time I was ready to cast aside all old prejudices for Oliver's sake. If you can't accept Oliver, that's your problem, Dad, I said calmly but firmly. I won't participate in family gatherings while you're ignoring him. He deserves support, just like any other member of this family. I turned to my mom, whose eyes were filled with tears, but she remained silent. I knew she couldn't make a choice between us either. I walked out of the room, feeling my heart pounding. I left the house knowing that I could no longer live by someone else's rules. My relationship with my father had changed forever, but I knew it was the right step. Oliver deserves support, and I was ready to give it to him. Reddit. User comments. Breaking traditions. That's a very brave step, Mark. Not everyone is ready to stand up against their own father for the sake of justice. Your brother will definitely feel your support. Lost and Found, 87. My father couldn't accept that I was transgender either. We didn't speak for 3 years, but eventually he came around. It's hard, but sometimes it's the only way. Family is family. You did the right thing. Family should support each other, even when they don't fully understand. Oliver is lucky to have a brother like you. Support the change. This is a story of true love for your loved ones. Thank you for sharing. I've also had conflicts with my family over a similar situation, and your words inspire me to keep fighting for myself. And how would you react if someone close to you transitioned? Have you faced similar situations in your family? Share your experiences in the comments. I'd love to hear your stories.